realization of the rights in question.
Thank you for this invitation. Of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Missy for her invitation. I'd like to welcome, of course, the good Professor Malhotra and all the representatives from the different Pacific Island countries. I do not intend to make a long speech. Professor Malhotra spoke actually some about some of the issues that I did want to address. But I think fundamentally, and as I was talking to Chitra, she was saying that some of you come from ministries of finance, some of you come from different departments, the Attorney General's office, etc., and predominantly from government itself. I think from a very practical perspective, the whole idea of human rights, whether civil or political rights or socio-economic rights, is to ensure that we have maintained human dignity. Human dignity is very, very important. Of course, we have seen a very dichotomous approach to human rights for a number of decades, in particular after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There tended to be a huge focus on civil and political rights as opposed to socio-economic rights. And many countries actually advocated for civil and political rights. And indeed, as I said a few months back at another workshop, that there was always even the entire discourse on human rights, in particular in developing countries, was predominantly focused on civil and political rights, at least in this part of the world. And indeed, in many what we may call first world countries or developed countries, you can look at countries like USA, for example, and some other European countries. There's been huge focus, and predominantly in North America, huge focus on civil and political rights, but nonetheless there has been very little focus on socio-economic rights. So you see a disparity between the application of those two spheres of rights. Of course, even in our part of the world, in Fiji, we have seen for a number of decades when journalists would actually, assess how we are performing. When indeed, even some of the UN agencies used to focus on how we're performing as far as human rights was concerned. Predominantly, it was actually focused on civil and political rights, to the neglect of socio-economic rights. But in Fiji, of course, and I'll talk to you about some of our experiences, the Fijian Constitution, which I have here with me, and we quite gladly share this with you. We've got pocket versions of this, and I'll ask the staff from the Attorney General's office to give you copies of that. In the Fijian Constitution, you'll find a whole plethora of civil, not just civil and political rights, but also for the first time, socio-economic rights. And you'll see this mirrored in the convention, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And in fact, this morning I was just sort of sitting down and going through the articles in the convention itself, and also our constitution. And you can see this almost mirrored, almost identically. But I'm happy to say that the Fijian Constitution probably goes one or two steps further than the actual convention itself. The point being, I think that you as policymakers, we need to be able to understand that, as the professor is highlighting, these rights need to be mainstreamed. We need to be able to understand that when we talk about rights, they cannot be sort of discussed in some faraway, distant, amorphous sphere where we think, it sits separately to mainstream policy making. It is very, very important for us to understand that the application of rights, in particular in this instance we have economic, social, and cultural rights, needs to be actually mainstreamed into our policies, because it actually provides durability, longevity to your policies. It actually makes ultimately good economic sense to be able to do that. And indeed, as we've argued previously, that sometimes you have political rights being infringed, civil and political rights being infringed, but the reason for the actual infringement is because of lack of socio-economic rights. When people don't have access to food, water, shelter, those very basic things such as health, people then can, as we've seen in other countries, whether it's the Arab Spring and various other places, it was not just simply about a political uprising. It was about a huge chunk of the population in many of those countries being marginalized from the mainstream economic activity of those countries. And that, of course, manifested itself in a political uprising. In Fiji, we've had disruptions to government in 1987 and in 2000. And you'll see, if you look at the genesis of that, if you look at why these things actually happened, it's because of people's inability to access some very basic socioeconomic rights, be able to access those fundamental socioeconomic privileges that others may have had. So you see, they're interlinked. And of course in some countries you'll see that they take the other approach, where they have a huge focus on economic rights, social rights, maybe cultural rights, but not necessarily civil and political rights. So we need to understand that they need to be equally applied. Climate change, of course, has been mentioned. And climate change, of course, is an existential threat to a number of Pacific Island countries and indeed many communities. We have countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, sorry. And we have, in our case, we've actually moved, or relocated, I should say, 3 villages to higher ground because of inundation of waters. We have another about 42 or 43 villages that have been earmarked to be moved to higher ground because, again, of encroaching waters. Now, this has a huge impact on the way in which these communities will live. They have been essentially coastal communities. They have a particular form of livelihood. If you're going to put them up on a hill or somewhere far away from where they used to live, it will have an impact on how they actually have sustained livelihoods. It may have an impact on the gender relationships that may exist. So these are many issues that actually does arise. And this is why, again, to draw that analogy, we do not separate, at least in Fiji, we do not separate a development agenda from your climate agenda. We believe they are one of the same. If you want to build resilience, if you want to have longevity of your infrastructure, you need to ensure that your development agenda actually is climate sensitized. A very classic example of that is that, similarly as we've recently come back from Germany and Bonn, we actually said that there should not be any distinction between development finance and climate finance, because they're really one of the same. If we have 6,000 kilometers of electrical cables going down after Cyclone Winston, which we had last year, then if you're going to put up those electrical cables up, and we have another cyclone this year, we are currently in a cyclone season, those electrical cables will go down again. We put them back up again, they'll go down again. So what's the solution? The solution is adaptation. The solution is putting those electrical cables underground, but they cost a lot more money. But it may in the long term actually be better to put them underground than to keep on putting them up every time they go down. So this is what you call building resilience into infrastructure. But climate change, of course, will mean if those electrical cables go down, people who get affected by that obviously won't be able to access electricity. The kids probably won't be able to read the school books at night. You may not get access to refrigeration if the electrical cables are down, and a whole plethora of other services that you may enjoy that you won't actually enjoy after such a cyclonic or climatic event. So I think when we talk about rights, again, the point that I like to make is that we need to be able to ensure that we have a basic understanding at governmental level that the application of these rights must be applied equally. We cannot have a dichotomous approach to that. Secondly, and I completely endorse what the good professor has said about a new way of thinking rights. And I think we cannot be prescriptive, too prescriptive. The conventions are fine, they provide a guidance, but it does not necessarily mean that just because you have not ratified the convention, you cannot in the meantime apply those rights. It cannot mean that only by ratifying the convention are you then okay. We need to be able to understand that by the application of these rights, it must be done in a very practical manner, very tangible manner. The other point that I'd also like to make is that there is a lack of jurisprudence in the South Pacific as far as socioeconomic rights are concerned. Even in Fiji, we've tried to encourage, we've had, for example, at the annual Attorney General's Conference, we've had a couple of sessions on that, where we're trying to get lawyers. There are a lot of lawyers who actually don't understand that in order to be able to have these rights enforced or fulfilled, we need to be able to pursue it through legally. To be able to see how we can pursue these rights vis-a-vis the state. So I think that's very critically important for us to be able to understand that, because of course you'll have instances where the state may not actually fulfill its obligations. The Indian, of course, judiciary has been very proactive. And they have, you know, in many instances where specific rights did not necessarily exist, they were read into this right. For example, right to life in India has been very widely read to be able to, for example, look at issues such as environment and various other issues. There has been, for those of you who are policymakers, there's a whole, you know, jurisprudence in countries like South Africa, where you see the progressive realization of rights has been interpreted, and actually quite interestingly. So, for example, right to health, there's a very famous case called Subramani. Right to housing, case called Grudboom. These are many different cases, and very interesting. You don't actually have to be a lawyer to actually read these cases. There's some very good summaries, three, four pages of them. And you'll be able to see how it's actually been applied, and how as policymakers we need to think about it. The good thing, of course, about the economic, social, and cultural rights is the progressive realization of it. No government is expected to be able to give housing to everybody. No government is able to give everybody access to kidney dialysis machine. And actually Subramani is a very good case in respect of that. It's a progressive realization. It's also within the available resources of the state. And I think we need to, again, as policymakers, be able to realize how there are certain fundamental, I suppose, demarcators we can actually reach without necessarily having to give the full plethora of the right from day one. And I think this is very important for us to be able to realize. Last but not least, of course, you know, the fact of the matter is that in Pacific Island countries, we need to be able to ensure that we are able to cooperate and collaborate with each other. Not all Pacific Island countries actually have all the resources. Not all the Pacific Island countries have all the technical know-how, all the assistance. So as we've said in other gatherings of Pacific Island countries, we need to be able to learn from each other. There may be jurisprudence that may have been developed in Fiji, maybe in Tonga, Samoa, or Solomon Islands, or Papua New Guinea, wherever it is. And we need to be able to get our judiciaries to be able to talk to each other, how we can actually further these rights within our jurisprudence. The other thing, of course, is the technical assistance, to be able to talk to each other. And hopefully we'll, you know, we've got people, of course, from the different countries here, for you to be able to develop those relationships, those, you know, the technical know-how sharing, I think is very, very important. The reality is that we have the SDGs, we have to meet our SDGs, but the reality, of course, at the same time is that many Pacific Island countries are cash-strapped. We are limited. We have limited economies of scale. You know, we have countries that have a population of, you know, 15,000 people. When you go to international fora and we tell them that, you know, Fiji is the second largest country, not even 1 million, people sort of laugh at you. And we are considered to be the second largest country as far as population is concerned. I mean, that's like the size of one suburb in some of the major cities in the world. So the economies of scale are very different. So our ability to be able to resource many of the institutions that actually are being created by these instruments are actually limited. Our ability to be able to resource and build the capacity, and let alone fund the various projects that are required for us to meet our SDGs and meet these international obligations are extremely limited. So therefore we need to be able to collaborate with each other. We need to be able to share information with each other, share the technical expertise. Hopefully there'll be the points of discussions. Because it's one thing to set up an institution, it's one thing to set up the process, but you need to have durability to it. You need to have continuity to it. Otherwise there's no point. We can all go there and cut a cake and cut a ribbon and garland each other. It all looks good for the papers or the TV. But we need to come back and say in 5 years' time, is it still there or not? Is it working or not? Indeed, the capacity has been built up or not? Similarly with the rights, we need to ensure that this is why I think it's very critical for us to understand the economic, social, and cultural rights are progressive realization of these rights. And we need to actually have those building blocks to be able to ensure that we meet these obligations. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank, of course, the office once again for the facilitation of this. The professor also highlighted that globalization, of course, has meant ability to access information, ability to, in some countries it has meant the reduction of poverty. But also with that we have seen in some countries that we didn't actually expect. There's a huge move to the right, where because globalization actually has brought insecurity for certain communities, and the inability to address those certain communities has meant, in fact, a derogation of already existing rights. We've seen in some countries the rise of communalism. We've seen in some countries where the threat of globalization has meant, because of changing or shifting capital, people have actually gone more to the right. So there's been xenophobia has been on the rise, as we've seen in some countries. Communalism has been on the rise in some parts in Asia. So, and also, of course, in Europe too, we've seen that. So we need to be also cognizant about that. And the solution, of course, for us is to be able to learn from these experiences, to ensure it doesn't actually happen in our own countries. And the only way to do that is to be able to ensure that the citizens of our countries actually have access to those fundamental rights. And don't just mean civil political rights, but socio-economic rights, which is very, very critical for us to be able to ensure that we have stability, we have confidence, and the citizens of our own countries actually feel confident in their own countries. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I wish you a very good workshop. Thank you.